highly recommend that you listen to this performance that's on YouTube. If you enter you'll hear this Daniel Barenboim recording. And it has Barenboim conducting from the keyboard. And it has the piano turned the way that Mozart would have positioned the piano, which was with his back to the audience. And so he's facing the orchestra, and he's around this way. And so it's a good representation of what you would have seen when Mozart premiered this work. So it was 1785. All right. The next work that we're going to look at is the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto. And Beethoven, as with his symphonies, was very much classical in the beginning of his career. So he continued the tradition of Mozart and Haydn. But especially with the concertos, the Mozart concerti that were the big models and influences. And so Beethoven didn't write as many concerti as Mozart did. So he wrote 5 concertos for piano, and these were works that he performed. And the first 2 are from his classical first period. The third, which is in C minor, is a middle period work, as are the 4th and 5th. So by the time Beethoven wasn't able to perform in public anymore, then he didn't write any more piano concertos. So there aren't any from the 3rd stylistic period. He also wrote 1 great violin concerto, one of the most important of the repertoire for the violinists. It's in D major. He also made a piano version of this work, which is kind of odd. You know, it's not performed very often, but there's a piano version. And then he also wrote a triple concerto. That term replaces the term concerto grosso in the classical period. And so triple just means 3 soloists. So this was for piano, violin, cello. So 7 concerti in total. But with the Beethoven concerti, they are much bigger and take the level of piano writing to a higher degree of virtuosity, just the types of figurations that he devised. So what we're going to see in the 19th century is the increasing importance of the virtuosic element in composition. And so this era witnessed the rise of public concerts that audience members would purchase tickets. It was a way of making money for the musicians. And they loved these virtuosic superstars. And the musicians who really were at the top of the profession in that sense were Paganini, Franz Liszt, Frédéric Chopin. But especially Paganini and Liszt played concerts throughout Europe that were wildly successful, and that spurred then a whole generation of musicians who tried to imitate their style to lesser and greater, extent of success. But it's led to a type of approach to the concerto that focused on the solo virtuosity. And so that very often overshadowed then the role of the orchestra, so that the orchestra was reduced to being just an accompaniment and a backup to this virtuosic display of the soloist. So there's two types. So the orchestra would have a secondary role in these works, and the spotlight is on the soloist. So if you listen to a Chopin piano concerto, when the soloist enters, then you hardly even notice the orchestra. It's just focusing on the solo part. Then the other side of the coin was the concerti of Brahms, who viewed this genre in a more symphonic way and viewed it like a symphony with this added element of the soloist, which doesn't mean that the soloist didn't have a hard part, because it was very, very difficult, but there was more of an equal partnership in the development of material between the orchestra and the soloist. So we'll put here a good example of this virtuoso concerto would be Chopin, and the best 19th century romantic concerto that's more orchestral is Brahms. And so we'll look at the second Brahms piano concerto here at the end of this section. All right, so the Beethoven Fourth is a work that really advances the genre, the concerto in the 19th century, and it is longer than Mozart. So you're going to hear the first movement that is about 18 minutes long. This Concerto D minor that we just heard was about 14 minutes long. And so Beethoven also is going to change things around a little bit. Instead of having an opening orchestra tutti that presents the themes, the way this concerto begins is with a statement of the A theme by the piano solo, unaccompanied. And so there are going to be some things that Beethoven does that are innovative. Another thing that happens in this concerto is, in the first movement, the Mozart model, typically, and not everyone did this. There was one, actually, the the C minor Mozart concerto, but that at the end of the cadenza, that was typically the end of the solo part, and you'd have a final section that was the 2D coda. But what Beethoven does is that the soloist continues to play to the end of the movement with the orchestra, and they end together. So they're both united together in that way. And so I'll write that up as a couple of things in the first movement. Now, what you're going to have on the listening ID is the second and third movements, but you should know a little bit about so this is in the key of G major. And it was written at the same time as the Fifth Symphony and the Sixth Symphony. It was actually premiered on this huge program that featured the premiere of the Fifth and Sixth Symphony. And Beethoven was the soloist in this premiere of it. So the first movement is a double exposition plan, so it's based on the Mozart model. So that's something that's unusual. So soloist continues to play all the way to the end of the first movement. All right, another thing about the Beethoven concerti is that Beethoven wrote cadenzas. In fact, he wrote multiple cadenzas. For his first piano concerto, there are 3 different Beethoven cadenzas for the first movement. For the fourth concerto, there are 2 different cadenzas to the first movement. And the second cadenza is longer and more elaborate. It's the one that's usually played nowadays. But what we'll see in the Emperor Concerto, which is the 5th, the last Beethoven piano concerto, is that Beethoven doesn't write the cadenza as an appendix, but instead writes it into the score. So the tradition was like what you just saw in the Mozart, which is at the point for the cadenza, you just have fermata over 1/6/4 chord, and then it says cadenza 5/7, and then it writes the score, and then you have an additional cadenza that wouldn't be written into the score itself there. But what Beethoven does in the Emperor is to say that the soloist has to play this cadenza, that you can't make up your own cadenza. And so Beethoven is now kind of ending that practice of improvised cadenzas, and that's something that will continue in the 19th century, that soloists won't improvise their own cadenzas anymore. All right, so we'll put here starts to disappear. So actually, with the fourth concerto, there are some other composers who've written cadenzas. Actually, Brahms wrote a cadenza for the fourth piano concerto. Clara Schumann wrote one. But nowadays, we just hear the Beethoven second cadenza usually in that first movement. All right. So big